Welcome to Mental Stillness. My name is Derek, and I'm excited that somehow you stumbled across this podcast. One of my goals when starting this podcast was to bring mental health conversations into leadership circles. Every podcast touches on both leadership and mental health and also provides specific next steps. And this podcast is still fairly new. I just started it last November. As I continue to get more guests and provide more content that helps you and your leadership team, if you could take just a minute and go over to Spotify, Apple, YouTube, wherever you're listening or viewing this, and just give me a rating and even leave a comment. The way the algorithms work, it just really helps this podcast get out to more people, and even share this with maybe someone who you feel like would benefit. Today's episode is going to cover a sensitive topic for many people, this idea of trauma. And I went back and forth on how I wanted to approach this topic because I know it hits at a deep level for many people. I want to say this podcast weaves in and out of both mental health conversations and also leadership. And sometimes the nature of the conversation leans towards mental health, and other times it leans towards leadership. A little bit of my concern is that people will see trauma in the description, and then maybe you primarily listen to this because of the leadership conversations that happen, and then you see something like trauma and you're like, eef. I want to encourage you to still lean in, to really take into what we talk about in this episode, because it's really going to help you as a leader in your organization. It's going to help you in life for your own journey, and then also the traumatic experiences of other people. We tried to navigate the conversation today and toe the line of education around trauma and then also application around trauma. And so we talk specifically to what does it mean for someone who's had traumatic experiences being on a team? What level of responsibility do they have in navigating their own trauma? And then also for the managers listening, when you have a team of people, what are some of the responsibilities that you have in leading other people? I really want to encourage you to listen to this episode. I brought on a good friend of mine and a fellow therapist, Alisha Hendrix. I've known her for over 15 years. I really appreciate her heart for people, and she specializes in trauma. I knew that she would bring a ton of wisdom and a ton of experience to this conversation. And my position on dealing with trauma is this. I believe that trauma benefits from connection, not isolation. And so I wanted to model that by even bringing somebody else on with me to have a conversation so we can link arms and tackle this conversation on trauma for you. So let's get to my conversation with my friend, Alisha Hendrix. Alisha, thank you for being on this episode of Mental Stillness and just, I guess, share a little bit about who you are and your background, just so our audience gets to know a little bit of your story. That'd be great.
I'm a native Kentuckian. I grew up in Kentucky. My mom still lives in the same house I've lived in since I was 2. So Kentucky definitely has a special place in my heart, and it's always going to be home. I graduated with my bachelor's in 2013. Actually started off as a studio art major and minored in psychology. And so the more counseling classes that I took, the more interested I became in the field. And so I decided after probably about my sophomore year to pursue my master's in counseling. And so right now I am a licensed professional counselor out here in Denver. I opened up my own practice. I came to Colorado thinking that I would only be here for 2 years. I had every intention of going back to Kentucky and, fell in love with the state and, have here we are 8 years later, and I'm almost a decade into my Colorado residency. And
it's wild it's been that long.
I know, it's growing my practice. I can hear I definitely turn the twang on and off, and just having conversation with you, I can hear the twang come back in.
You're
Uh,
welcome. I'm just keeping you. I'm keeping
I
you
know.
grounded, and you're welcome for that.
I was like, I can't say that I'm from Kentucky and not have a
Hmm.
little bit of that Kentucky flair, but it definitely switches on and off depending on who I'm talking to.
I know with specifically, I think about some of our shared background and in counseling
Mhm.
and having clients and today's conversation being specifically geared towards trauma is really the heart of this, and I know we're going to get into that in a minute, and I feel like it's a conversation sometimes that for a lot of reasons, if the conversation around trauma happens, it's in counseling context or it's in the
Mhm.
counseling kind of space. But I'm like, how do we broaden that to shed a little bit more light on it, to normalize it, to give people give some of our leaders just some maybe even redefine what it is and what it's not. There's a lot of horrible advice and horrible descriptions of that. No shade, but actually shade on TikTok around some of this with it. And so I just want to kind of give people a little bit of an overview of what trauma is and maybe how to handle that in the workplace, whether you yourself are experiencing that or that you're maybe a manager that has people on your team. Like, I don't know, what are some best practice type things? And so we're going to get into all that, but I would love to start with just Alisha, having you speak into this idea of big T trauma and little
Mhm.
T trauma. And so we've probably all heard that language before, but I guess just share a little bit about how you would define that, or what that kind of means to you as you hear that.
So my overall, and it seems strange that trauma is something that I'm passionate about, but my overall interest really lies within the fact that trauma is a universal experience. And I tend to work from the lens of it's all trauma, and it is all trauma, because regardless of what the experience is, whether it's that big T trauma that you're referring to, so things like abuse, losing a parent at a very early age, having a parent who's addicted, things along those lines, whether it be those big T trauma items or those little T trauma items, it all impacts the way our nervous system functions.
Mm-hmm.
And when our nervous system is impacted, then the way that we respond is impacted, our mood is impacted, how we regulate, if we are able to regulate, is impacted. There's a very big trickle down effect in that sense.
Do you care to expound upon that a little bit to our listeners? Like, what do you mean by it being physiological?
Sure. So as we develop, as we're going through our just normal experiences, or for some, not normal experiences, what we do know, what science tells us, is that our brain develops from the back forwards. So that first piece of our brain to develop is our amygdala. It is online and aware as soon as we are born. And our amygdala is responsible for our fight, flight, or freeze. So if we are born into an environment where, ideally, like, our needs are being met, we're not sitting in a dirty diaper for too long, we have parents who are attentive and who show up, our parents have enough access to resources to pay for the things that we need, regular doctor's visits, medication, vaccinations, food, shelter, so on and so forth. That's in an ideal world. But then you start adding in stressors and just everyday life things. So depending on what our situation looks like, our amygdala's response to our environment can be very dependent upon those stressors that are happening in our environment. If we just so happen to be born to, say, a single mother, she's the only person capable and present potentially to meet those needs. And I don't have babies of my own at this point in my life. Maybe one day that will happen, but I know enough to know that when you have a newborn, you're not getting much sleep. A mother's inability to be promptly attentive when she is sleep deprived and doesn't have help and stressed and, maybe she's taking care of other babies, other kids or whatever, impacts the way that our amygdala is responding to our environment. So it's nothing intentional that has happened. It's just the circumstance that we've been born into. And so we then learn my environment is not able to meet my needs, or my environment is inconsistent at meeting my needs. And so, depending on the various trajectories that pattern can take, kind of is the premise of those early childhood experiences that can impact how our nervous system develops from the get-go, and our attachment style, and, what we're looking at in terms of early childhood experiences that impact trauma.
Mm-hmm. Then obviously sometimes behaviors develop to where people are trying to conjure up some of these needs being met, right? And so sometimes there's behaviors and things that people will do to try to get certain needs met. It may not always be the most savory or most healthy, but I think sometimes too, kind of back to the trauma part, it's sometimes easy to look at somebody else and we see the behaviors that they're doing, but behind that might be a traumatic reason it's happening, right? It's a learned behavior they had to do to survive or to get their needs met in a certain season. And so that's where, this idea of broadening maybe our understanding of trauma can be helpful. So as you see clients, as you see people, like, it seems like shame's always attached in some way, or can be attached in some way to trauma. So I guess share a little bit about why shame is felt. Again, like you said, it may not be something they asked for, something that happened to them, but yet they're over here and they have shame about it happening to them. So I guess what comes to mind for you is why shame is so prevalent in the conversation with trauma for people.
I think one of the big aspects, especially when it comes to shame, is that we don't always need to have an awareness as to why that emotional experience is happening in order to feel it. And so, now as an adult, I'm able to articulate, growing up as a child, I felt a lot of shame, and for reasons that were unbeknownst to me at the time. So growing up, I was not a strong reader. And that was always one of and even today, it doesn't carry as much weight, but even today, it is a point of shame for me because it resulted in that aspect of okay, you're not a strong reader. We're not going to, move you forward grade wise. And I'm pretty sure I was one of the last generations to ever be held back. And so
that's an accomplishment, by the way.
Right. And unbeknownst to me and my family, grew up with ADHD and didn't understand. Nobody knew that was the reason why reading was so difficult for me. And so I went through decades of school because I wasn't diagnosed with ADHD until after I became a therapist. And so I was 30, I think I was 32, but I'm walking around, school and on this earth thinking that I'm stupid. And it seems like a small thing now to reflect back on it, but it didn't
feel small at the time though.
It did not feel small at the time. And so just being, carrying that shame with, oh, I'm stupid, I don't know how to read. And anytime a class concept, geometry was also something that was really difficult to me. Anytime those things didn't just click, it always was rooted in that shame of, well, you're stupid. Mm-hmm. You can't read, you can't do geometry either. So there was it very easily created an unnecessary bridge there for me between this part of me that I didn't know existed, this ADHD, this difficulty with executive functioning skills, and things that didn't come naturally that I needed to learn in a different way so that it made sense to my brain. And so again, I think I tend to work from the lens of it's all trauma, whether it be big T trauma, little T trauma, it's impacting the way that our nervous systems function. And what a lot of people don't tend to consider is that when it comes to emotional regulation, that is something that has to be taught. Just like any other skill or any behavior, emotion regulation has to be taught. We have to learn how to regulate our emotions. If we aren't living in an environment that is supportive of that, we're going to be at a deficit in that area. If we have a diagnosis like ADHD, we're going to be at a deficit in that area. If we have a parent who is not regulated themselves, we're going to have a deficit in that area. And so why I think the perspective of it's all trauma is helpful is because it broadens that perspective. What I hope to do is help people to challenge their preconceived notions of trauma, and helps them to give more attention to those aspects of their life where maybe my needs weren't being met effectively. And, there's potentially a reason here why, I explode every single time I have a conversation, or, when I'm tired, I fly off the handle, or,
back to those behaviors, right?
Yeah. I can't seem to calm myself down. I just lash out.
I love what you said, Alisha, just with, and I'll say why I love it. It's not going to sound like I love it by saying, and that put me at a deficit, and that put me at a further deficit. Like, these things are stacked up against people. But the reality of trauma, and I think one big reason this conversation is so necessary ongoingly, I heard it said one time that trauma may be very common in life, but it doesn't have to be a life sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that, because there's a piece of hope in that. There's a validation on the front end of it's common in life. We probably all are going to have some, statistically, a very high probability we're all going to have traumatic experiences. But on the other side, it doesn't have to be debilitating forever. It's not a life sentence. There's ways to regulate. There's ways to heal from this. But a big part of it is education and understanding and self-compassion, compassion towards others. And so what are some examples of maybe how trauma would show up in the workplace? I think that would be helpful. And then are there any kind of practical tools that maybe a manager could be mindful of in trying to navigate that? Again, they're not a therapist, but
right.
they're a manager, and they're trying to lead these people well. So what comes to mind for you?
Just to be able to keep in mind that anytime you are in relationship with another person, you are in relationship with somebody who has experienced trauma to some degree. And being able to recognize that those experiences potentially have an impact in behavioral or emotion regulation ways, being able to understand that there may be some challenges or deficits in terms of emotion regulation, task completion, behaviorally, socially, coworker to coworker is important. And so I think if managers can have the courage to be curious, not just about themselves, but also about other, the people, they're potentially leading, it can help to improve that communication and that working relationship. I've always had authority issues. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's that Southern thing. I don't know if it's, that mixed race thing. I have no idea. But I've always had authority issues. It has always been, I remember calling my first supervisor ma'am, after I had just graduated from grad school. And she had actually redirected me, and she was like, please don't call me ma'am. And I was like, but I'm supposed to. That's respectful. And so just being aware of some of those more ingrained patterns and how some of people's previous experiences may impact the way that they function today. I've had, a couple of jobs since that very first post-grad job. And if I got an email saying XYZ, not that, hey, we need to chat about such and such, instant panic. It always was it definitely, activated that shame for me as far as oh crap, what did I do? I screwed something up. And going in there, I'm not somebody who's personally very defensive, but I every single time can remember going in a panic and just, I'm going to get fired. It was always worst case scenario. And so some people, interacting with managers or supervisors may bring out defensiveness or anger, or potentially they have interpersonal challenges with working with other coworkers. And so just being able to sit down with your employee and talk about this is the type of culture that we want to create. When challenges do arise, I think the way that a manager approaches and handles those is very important. So having that ability to be curious and lead with curiosity versus, condemnation or blame is always going to be in the benefit of that working relationship. And then being able to come up with collaborative solutions. If you have one employee who struggles with like task completion, we are always behind. I always preface anybody who is in relationship with me, I am always late. It is nothing personal. It is literally like my biggest hurdle when it comes to my ADHD personally. But if you have an employee who is consistently behind on tasks and, that emotion regulation aspect where you have to be regulated to tackle the things on your to-do list, you have to be able to ground yourself and not become overwhelmed to the extent to where you just activate that freeze response is activated and you're like, I don't even know where to start. Approaching an employee with like, hey, this is a pattern that I've noticed. I just want to know, what's going on and what can I do to support you? Just figuring out where those holes are as far as people's learnings. We don't know what we don't know. So if we're struggling with time management or if we're missing a step in a procedure, we're not going to just be aware of that until somebody brings it to our attention, and then figuring out a way that works for us specifically as far as, okay, how do we address this?
I want to make sure people catch the skill of not making assumptions, which I think it's easy when you, again, back to you're looking at the behavior. It's real easy as a leader to take things personally. But my question would be, before you take it personally, maybe investigate, is there another reason? That if you go to immediately the place of assumption, you're not really getting to the root, and there's probably not going to be really any progress. And you use that word collaboration, like you're not going to feel like a safe person for them to collaborate with or want to, because they're going to feel it's probably going to push them further into the shame side of things. And so I love the posture for managers, if you see certain behaviors that go against the culture, that are impeding progress, adopting the position of like, hey, let me care first and try to understand and not make assumptions, and at least extend an invitation to try to understand. And that person may take you up on it, they might not. And if they do start sharing, I think I know of leaders who worry about like that feels a little squishy for them and their personality. And it's like, well, if I start listening and start to kind of poke in those kind of areas, like, what am I going to hear? What's going to happen? And sometimes it's just like, and what am I going to say? I'm going to hear something and I'm not going to have an answer. And we have this fear of an awkward conversation or a hard conversation, where I think it's important for people to understand that if someone is sharing about their struggles and their challenges and maybe trauma, like there's an element where they probably don't need a lesson from you. They probably just need you to listen.
Yeah.
And so being a safe person that can kind of do that. And then I think that comes to mind. Patience, empathy, for sure, comes to mind. Empathy. Talk about empathy for a second. What do you mean by that? I know that's a word that we hear a lot. How could that be a tool for connection?
I think it goes back to like my belief in trauma is universal. So if we can broaden our perspective on what is encompassed when it comes to trauma, what qualifies, so to speak, and recognize that trauma is universal and it has a similar impact from person to person, it's going to impact the way our nervous system regulates, then it makes it easier for us to access that empathy. I don't need to know your big T trauma. I don't need to know specifics necessarily about the things that you experienced to be able to know, hey, this is an area of deficit for you, or this is a skill that nobody taught you how to develop. I can understand that. We're better able to access that empathy and lead with empathy versus the assumptions that, somebody is lazy or, stupid or doesn't understand, so on and so forth. I
like how this conversation right now, there's some tools and things on just say the manager side, someone who's trying to just lead people on their team well and lead better. I love the responsibility of that, because I think leaders can create change and create positive work environments and positive cultures. And there's a lot of work environments that conjures up more shame because people aren't leading from a healthy position, or they're not leading with empathy, or they're not taking the time to connect and understand people. That's why, engagement globally is terrible right now in organizations across the board. And I think that's connected to this as well. Do you have any kind of advice for people who are on a team? Let's say that we have a listener that understands that, wow, due to traumatic experiences in their past, and it may have not been yesterday, it could have been years ago, but they know that that's caused certain behavioral patterns in them that they're aware of, and they still battle. How can they address that in the workplace with their leaders? Flipping that responsibility part, how can they be responsible for a bit of that in making things move in a healthier direction?
So just because somebody has behavioral implications, that does not mean that there are not still boundaries and expectations that need to be met. But I think that's a lot of times where managers struggle, is like, if they don't, it's that concept of, if I am not authoritative, then I will not be respected or listened to. And so, being able to, again, lead with curiosity, collaborate with an individual and see if there are the deficits that they are presenting with or the challenges that are coming up with their work, so on and so forth. It is up to that individual as to whether or not they want to respond, and whether or not they want to grow or take the opportunity to collaborate. That's fine. And ultimately, if they decide that they don't, then you get to decide what their future in that company looks like. There is accountability, I believe, on both parts. We all don't get to just like throw our hands up and say, I have trauma. I get to be as emotionally dysregulated as I want.
Yeah. Deal with my behaviors. I'm not going to change.
Yeah. I would also blame TikTok for that. We are very detached from the understanding that our behavior and our actions have actual real life lived and experienced consequences for other people. And the only experience of accountability in that area is within a job, because it's difficult to hold one, or, you're put on support plans, so on and so forth. And so, on top of actively listening, being curious and collaborative, I think also communicating those expectations and expressing those boundaries is important for managers to know. That is also an important aspect for managers to be aware of and be upfront with. And if there isn't an agreement that can be reached, then people get to decide what they want to do with that information.
If you're a leader, if you're a member of a team who knows that, you have some of these behavioral patterns or whatever they might be, that might be trauma responses, but who is your supportive people, right? Making sure that you have that is being dealt with. The workplace may not be the primary environment it needs to be dealt with for whatever reason. I think there's also an element of, it would be really helpful for you to recognize that without a little bit of information around that, and again, I'm not saying you have to share your stuff with everybody, but at least speaking into, if your manager only sees the behaviors and you've never kind of helped them, let's say that they've taken a genuine interest, maybe you've been disciplined due to said behaviors, like those would be really good opportunities for you to share, maybe at a very general level of hey, maybe there's something beyond just, this isn't just me being disrespectful. In my last job, this was an issue too. Actually, I've had this issue since I was a kid. If you can give a little bit of insight to that, I think that grows, it should with a good leader, a good boss should grow the empathy and hopefully grow the understanding. So then they know a little bit more of your context. If we're shut down and consumed with the shame side of it and just being locked up, it makes it a whole lot easier for other people just to guess where the behaviors are coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that can be really hard because then you're over here being misunderstood, but this leader over here doesn't have anything else to work with other than just the behaviors they're observing.
Right.
And so I guess finding some healthy ways to share a little bit of that, which takes a ton of vulnerability, a ton of trust. That gets a whole lot harder if you've tried that before and it's blown up in your face, or you didn't have a healthy leader that was there to receive that. And so there's not a cookie cutter answer to this. I get that. But I feel like if you have a genuine leader that's inquiring and they're having a coaching conversation around a behavior, like maybe if I could encourage you to divulge a little bit about your story so they at least have somewhat of an idea. This isn't just me saying, I'm going to do my own thing, because that might be what they take away if you don't kind of meet them halfway in that. So I feel like this trauma conversation, both sides have responsibility in dealing with it.
Yeah, it's so broad. I do not believe that it is a manager's responsibility to go hunt and figure out and pry into every single employee's life and figure out what that specific trauma is. And, psychoanalyze it to the extent to where, it makes sense. And this is what we can do to move forward. There is a personal responsibility of awareness. It is my responsibility as an individual to know these hurdles and these things, these areas where I struggle, and advocate for myself on behalf of that. And best case scenario, we do have a supportive manager who is like, I can absolutely understand that. Like, how can I support you? How can I show up for you differently? How do you need me to communicate with you? Obviously, I'm in Denver. My entire family, all my immediate family and my closest friends are all back in Kentucky. And there was one instance where my mother called me. I think she didn't leave a voicemail, or she didn't tell me that nothing was wrong. And I instantly panicked, because being away from home, like, one of my biggest fears is something's going to happen and I'm going to get that phone call and, just receive, who knows what's happening when where I'm at when I receive that news. And so now every single time she calls, she'll leave a voicemail or she'll shoot me a text right after that says, nothing's wrong, just wanted to chat. And so when we know where those areas of difficulty or deficit or challenge are arising, as managers, they can shift their behavior accordingly to support the individual. Yeah. We are not robots. We are not all the same. You cannot treat Sam the same as you treat Nancy. You have to be able, as a manager, you have to be able to be flexible and fluid with your employees as well. If you have trouble getting up for a shift and you can't show up on time, like, maybe you try a couple of different times, but if you're perpetually late, like that, there's allowed to be a boundary there for, presented by managers. So being flexible, but also being flexible within reason.
Maybe there's some creative ways to set them in a different role that maybe more aligns with their
skill set.
Yeah, skill set, if that can work in your context. I know that's really different industry to industry, but maybe that's something worth exploring. Sometimes events happen to where, the trauma we experienced or happened to us. I mean, you could think of a car wreck situation, a natural disaster, COVID, relational turmoil, family abuse, like all these things that no one said, hey, let me sign up for that. It part of life. It was messy. It happened. While the trauma wasn't a choice, people do have a choice in what this means moving forward. Choose to deal with it or to not deal with it. What comes to mind for you is to the implication if someone is aware that they experienced trauma and they're just not, maybe they've not started doing the work yet.
It's going to show up. I think regardless of the relationship that you're looking at, because remember, anytime you're in relationship with somebody, you are in relationship with somebody who has experienced trauma. And whether, people be aware of it and they, because of shame or guilt, they sweep it under the rug and refuse to acknowledge it, it's still going to have some impact on your behavior. It means that you're consistently in that survival mode. And when we behave and act from survival mode, our nervous system is consistently and perpetually activated. If we go into every single situation with this mindset of, I am unsafe, how do I survive? Yeah, it's going to bring those less desirable behaviors to the forefront. So while I tell my clients all the time, while the work isn't comfortable, it is worth it to do the work, because then you almost get to reclaim that control over your own life, instead of your trauma being the thing that dictates how you show up in a space. You then get to dictate how you show up in that space. Trauma is neurological. It's going to have those impacts in ways that we are not going to be able to identify if we don't take the time to do the work. So it's uncomfortable, but you've already survived the worst part of it.
Healing is absolutely possible. It's going to show up. There's an element of it that trauma would fail miserably and lose every time at hide and go seek. It's kind of like when my daughter plays, and as soon as you say, okay, you're done counting, she screams from the other room, I'm in here. It's like, okay, there's the self-ownership part. And then in the workplace, because it's going to show up, you're not going to leave that at the door when you clock in. It's going to go with you to work. And so you get to decide at what level to divulge any of that, but you should, at minimum, be self-aware enough to know that some of your behaviors and different things that are going to surface, and you might need professional help to, and again, I think that's a relief for managers listening. None of this conversation is asking any of you managers to do something, and it would be horrible for you to step in and to do that in that kind of way. That's not your role in this. I think that education's your role. I think there's empathy's your role. I think trying to understand, trying to appropriately accommodate. Yes, hold the standards of the company, but also see people as the human beings that they are. But there might be some professional support that people need through this. And so the only time it's being dealt with should not be in the work context. Hopefully it's an environment that accommodates that to where there can be some positive movement. If it's a good fit and if it can work, hopefully there's progress there. Or there's also some roles that just may not match where you're at or how you're wired or what's happened. And that's okay too. So I think that's where giving yourself a little bit of the freedom to hear that might be helpful.
Just to add, I tell my clients all the time, you don't have to process every single one of your individual big T traumas in order to move forward. You just have to do the work to where you can start building those connections between cause and effect, and begin to start gaining a general understanding of how your nervous system has been impacted and what is the result of that. And then you just learn new skills to cope. And that looks different for everybody. I will also add that my plug, anytime I start with a new client or do a consult call, I tell people all the time, therapists are not one size fits all. We don't all specialize in trauma. So going to a therapist who is trauma informed and can speak to the impact that trauma has on your life is very important. People are not going to come to me for eating disorders. I don't work with eating disorders. I don't specialize in it. I have a general understanding. It would be unethical for me to work with them.
You're not going to go to a podiatrist to get your tonsils taken out.
Exactly. And if you are sitting with a therapist, if you're sitting across from a therapist and the vibe is just off, or you just cannot click with them as the client and you're there to do the work, there is nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. Go find somebody else.
Yep. And that doesn't mean therapy isn't for me.
Right. So I always therapist shop, be open to the experience, but recognize that whether or not you jive with that therapist is going to have an impact on the work that you are able to do and the progress that you want to make.